Imagine the most powerful man in Europe is staring at you, and your entire life, your wealth, your family's future, even your physical safety depends entirely on whether or not you are granted the honor of holding his dirty undershirt. Imagine a world where the highest-ranking nobles in the land, men who commanded private armies and owned entire provinces, spent their mornings fighting over who got to hand the king his glass of water or help him pull on his breeches. This was the glittering, golden nightmare of Versailles under Louis XIV. It was a palace designed not just for luxury, but as a weapon of psychological warfare. Here, the Sun King didn't just rule his subjects, he broke them. He turned the proudest aristocrats of France into domestic servants, trapped in a gilded cage where the currency wasn't gold, but the king's attention, and where the ultimate punishment wasn't a dungeon, but simply being ignored. This is the story of how Louis XIV used humiliation as the primary tool of absolute power, creating a system so suffocatingly precise that it eventually helped spark the fires of the French Revolution. To understand the scale of this psychological trap, you first have to understand the smell. We often imagine Versailles as a place of pristine marble and sweet perfumes, but in the 17th century, it was a sensory assault. With thousands of people packed into a palace that lacked modern plumbing, the corridors often reeled of human waste and rotting food. Yet, in this environment of physical filth, the social rules were obsessively clean. Every single movement, every gesture, and every word was governed by the etiquette. This wasn't just a set of manners, it was a cage. The king had transformed the daily acts of living, waking up, eating, walking, and sleeping into elaborate religious rituals where he was the only god. The day began with the petit lever, the ceremonial waking of the king. At 8 a.m. exactly, the first valet de chambre would wake Louis. This was the start of a multi-stage theater performance. Only the most favored individuals were allowed into the room in waves, known as entries. If this story kept you watching, support the channel by hitting like and staying with us for future deep dives. To be invited to the first entry was the ultimate status symbol. To be relegated to the last was a public shaming. Imagine being a duke of the realm, standing in a crowded bedroom, watching another man be granted the privilege of holding the king's right sleeve while he dressed. If Louis didn't look at you, if he didn't offer a slight nod of his head, you were socially dead. Nobles would spend years, decades perfecting the art of standing in the right spot, just to be noticed. A common phrase whispered in the halls of Versailles was, "The king looked at him today," or worse, "The king said he does not know him." To be unknown by the king meant you had no power, no influence, and no future. This was Louis's greatest invention, the domestication of the nobility. Before his reign, the French aristocrats were a constant threat to the throne. They lived in their own fortified castles, raised their own taxes, and frequently rebelled against the crown. Louis saw this and decided that if he couldn't kill their ambition, he would drown it in vanity. He forced the nobility to live at Versailles. By doing so, he stripped them of their local power bases. They could plot a rebellion if they were too busy worrying about whether they were allowed to sit on a chair or a stool in the presence of the queen. The hierarchy of seating was one of the most potent forms of humiliation. In the presence of the king, almost everyone stood. Only the most elite women were granted a taboret, a simple, backless stool. To the modern ear, winning the right to sit on a stool sounds absurd. But in Versailles, women would ruin their family's finances and enter into bitter, lifelong blood feuds just to secure one. If a duchess was seen sitting, while a countess was forced to stand, the social humiliation was absolute. It was a constant, visual reminder of exactly where you stood in the great chain of being, but the king's control went far beyond furniture. He controlled the very clock of their lives. Louis was famous for his punctuality. It was said that one could set their watch by his movements. If he was walking through the Hall of Mirrors at 12:15, you had to be there. But you couldn't just stand there. You had to be dressed in the latest, most expensive fashions. This was the financial trap. Louis intentionally created an environment where the dress code was so extravagant and changed so frequently that it was impossible to keep up without massive debt. A single outfit for a court ball could cost more than a nobleman's annual income from his estates. When the nobles ran out of money, which they inevitably did, they had to turn to the king for pensions, gifts, and graces. By making them poor, Louis made them dependent. They became beggars in silk and lace. He would watch them go into debt to buy the very clothes required to stand in his presence, and then he would enjoy the power of deciding which of them he would rescue with a handful of gold. It was a cycle of forced extravagance followed by humble petitioning. He didn't want his nobles to be strong, he wanted them to be decorative and desperate. The humiliation extended to the most private moments of life. The privilege of the stool wasn't just about sitting in the parlor, it extended to the king's bathroom habits. One of the most sought-after positions in the entire kingdom was the portier de fer, the person who looked after the king's portable toilet. To modern sensibilities, this is the height of degradation, but in the twisted logic of Versailles, being near the king while he was at his most vulnerable was a position of immense power. It meant you had his ear. You could whisper a request for a favor or a promotion while the king was occupied. The nobles had been so thoroughly broken that they viewed attending to the king's bodily functions as a peak of career achievement. Even the way people walked and talked was policed. You didn't knock on a door at Versailles that was considered vulgar. Instead, you had to grow out the fingernail on your little finger and gently scratch at the wood until a guard or valet opened it. Imagine the scene: hundreds of grown men, warriors and leaders, standing in a hallway scratching like mice at a door, hoping to be let in. If you were ignored, you simply kept scratching or waited for hours. Time was the king's to give and yours to waste. He made the most powerful people in France wait in drafty corridors, sometimes for an entire day, just to see him walk from one room to another. The king's psychological brilliance lay in his silence. Louis XIV was a master of the short answer. Often, when a noble would approach him with a heartfelt plea for help or a complex political proposal, the king would simply look at them and say, "I shall see." That was it. No yes, no no, just a terrifying vacuum of information. The noble would then spend weeks agonizing over what "I shall see" meant. Did he like me? Was he angry? Did I bow low enough? This uncertainty kept the court in a state of constant, low-level anxiety. Anxiety is the enemy of rebellion. A man who is worried about whether the king liked his hat doesn't have the mental energy to plan a coup. This environment created a culture of extreme cruelty among the courtiers themselves. Because everyone was competing for a limited amount of royal favor, the court became a Shark Tank. The Duke of St. Simon, who wrote extensive memoirs of this time, describes a world where people spent their entire lives observing others for the slightest slip in etiquette. If a rival wore the wrong color of ribbon or sat down a second too early, it was a cause for celebration and public mockery. They were like crabs in a bucket, pulling each other down so that no one could climb out and get closer to the sun. One of the most famous examples of the king's humiliation by favor was the Justicorps a brevet. This was a blue jacket embroidered with gold and silver that only a handful of men were allowed to wear. The king would personally grant the permit to wear it. It didn't come with money or land, it was just a jacket. But because the number of people allowed to wear it was strictly limited, it became a source of insane jealousy. If the king gave a jacket to a low-ranking noble, it was a calculated slap in the face to the higher-ranking dukes. He used fashion to disrupt the natural social order, ensuring that no one ever felt secure in their rank. The physical layout of Versailles itself was an instrument of this hierarchy. The closer your rooms were to the king's bedchamber, the more powerful you were. But the irony was that the privileged rooms were often the most miserable. They were small, cramped, freezing in the winter, and suffocating in the summer. High-ranking princes lived in tiny attics with slanted ceilings and no fireplaces, all because those rooms were physically closer to the king than a comfortable mansion in Paris would be. They chose to live in squalor for the sake of proximity. Louis had convinced them that a drafty closet near him was worth more than a palace away from him. And then there were the red heels. Louis XIV decreed that only those who had been presented at court could wear shoes with red heels. These became the ultimate badge of belonging. If you weren't wearing red heels, you were a nobody. You were invisible, but even with the heels, you were never safe. The king could decide at any moment to change the rules. He played with the lives of his courtiers like a cat plays with a mouse. He would encourage a noble to spend his last cent on a magnificent garden, only to visit the garden once, say nothing, and never return, effectively bankrupting and shaming the man in one move. The most terrifying part of this system was that there was no off switch. The etiquette applied 24 hours a day. Even when the king was traveling, the rules followed. If the king's carriage passed you on the road, you had to stop, get out of your own carriage, and bow in the mud, regardless of the weather. There was no privacy, The king's life was a public performance, and therefore, so was yours. Your failures, your debts, your marital problems, everything was fodder for the court's gossip, and the king used that gossip as a form of intelligence. He had a massive network of spies and intercepted letters. He knew who was sleeping with whom, who was losing at cards, and who was complaining about the food. He would then use this information in the most subtle, humiliating ways, dropping a hint during dinner that let someone know their deepest secrets were not secret at all. You might wonder why they stayed. Why did these men and women endure such constant, soul-crushing humiliation? The answer is both simple and tragic. Louis had made Versailles the only world that mattered. Outside of Versailles, there was only the provinces, a word used by courtiers to mean a kind of social death, a wilderness where nothing ever happened. To be exiled from court was considered a fate worse than physical death. It meant you were no longer part of the sun's orbit, you were in the dark. This system of humiliation worked perfectly for Louis XIV. He reigned for 72 years, the longest of any European monarch, and he died in his bed as an absolute ruler. But the cost was hidden in the foundation of the French state. By turning the nobility into useless, decorative puppets, he removed the middle layer of government. The nobles no longer cared about governing their lands or caring for their peasants. They only cared about the etiquette of the king's bedroom. As the decades passed, the gap between the glittering, cruel world of Versailles and the starving reality of the rest of France grew into a chasm. The nobles, trapped in their cycle of debt and ritual, were oblivious to the growing rage outside the palace gates. They had been so thoroughly humiliated by their king that they had lost the ability to be leaders. They were just survivors of a very expensive, very beautiful, and very cruel game. When Louis XIV finally died, the system didn't disappear, it just became more brittle. His successors lacked his terrifying charisma and his absolute discipline. They kept the rules, they kept the etiquette, and they kept the humiliation, but they lost the control. The sun had set, but the cage remained. The nobility continued to fight over stools and jackets while the world around them began to burn. In the end, the humiliation of the French court serves as a haunting reminder of what happens when power is divorced from purpose. Louis XIV created a masterpiece of social engineering, a world where he was the center of everything and everyone else was diminished. He proved that you don't need chains to enslave people. You just need to make them believe that their worth depends entirely on your approval. He turned the pride of France into a collection of red heels and scratching fingernails, and in doing so, he ensured that when the revolution finally came, there would be no one left with the strength or the respect to stand in its way. The gilded halls of Versailles, for all their beauty, were built on the systematic breaking of the human spirit, one bow, one stool, and one dirty shirt at a time. As we look back at the Sun King, we see a man who understood the darkest parts of human nature. Our desire for status, our fear of being ignored, and our willingness to endure almost any indignity if it means we are included. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a mirror held up to the vanity of man. And the reflection it showed was one of a nobility that had traded its honor for the privilege of helping a king get dressed. It is perhaps the most elegant, most expensive, and most successful act of mass humiliation in human history.